Welcome, everyone. This is the Shooting It Straight podcast with Justin Jackson. I am producer John. We are sponsored by Johnny T-shirt and Congruity HR, and we're excited to be here on a Monday night to talk about the Tar Heels. A really exciting game on Saturday against Boston College, an overtime win for North Carolina. We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about, as the title of the show says, a defining stretch for UNC basketball. These next four games really feel like they will make or break the season. UNC is on the NCAA tournament bubble, so a huge opportunity for North Carolina to pick up some quality wins, get themselves off the bubble. A Duke game, a rivalry game in there as well. We'll talk about all of that tonight on the show. Justin, I'm going to come to you to talk a little bit about that win over Boston College. I don't think it was a game that anybody expected in terms of the score. Hitting biscuits like that, not necessarily something you would expect. And Boston College almost hitting biscuits, that's extremely surprising. What were some of your biggest takeaways from that Boston College win?
Yeah, I think your description of it being an exciting game, I think that was by the end of it, it was an exciting game. But up until the final score said 102-96, I don't necessarily know if anybody was really excited watching it. Um, there was a few things that stood out to me. I think this was kind of an outlier of the whole season. We've talked about the difference in size and how inside has been a problem. We've talked about not being able to shoot the ball well. We've talked about, RJ trying to get back into a rhythm. We've talked about Ian and Seth and how do they play together. I think you got to give a lot of credit to Boston College in this game. Um, yeah, there were, inside there were some issues. I think the two bigs that they had, I think it was Vinning and Hastings. They didn't have crazy numbers, but there were times where it was just too easy for them inside. So if there's one thing that I can point at, maybe that was the one thing that I can really say maybe could be an issue moving forward. But that's also been something that we've talked about all season. Um, but the reason I say we got to give a lot of credit to Boston College, there was a lot of shots that they hit that were very well defended. Um, Donald Hand Jr., he hit some shots, especially down the stretch, that are difficult for anybody to knock down. And so you got to give him credit. Obviously, he had a huge game. I mean, Beadle, their other guard, I don't think he missed a single shot. So for a team to come into the Dean Dome and shoot 55% and 58% from three, yeah, maybe there was some messed up assignments and things like that. But from what I was watching, there was a lot of times where there was a good hand whenever these guys went into their jump shot and they just knocked them down. So I think for me, it was more of Boston College hit a lot of shots. I mean, we out rebounded them 36-23, which a lot of that goes back to them not really missing. But we had 12 offensive rebounds. And so I think that's why I kind of say this is an outlier. I think it's one where I can't necessarily say, man, they just played so terrible against the last place team in the ACC. There's lulls just like any other time in games, but Boston College hit a ton of shots, and I got to give them credit.
Looking at the box score, there's a couple of different stat lines that stand out. First of all, when you score 102 points, everyone's going to have pretty good numbers. A lot of people put the ball in the basket
Mm-hmm.
on Saturday. Ian with 19, RJ 22 points. That's what we've come to expect from him. 8 of 8 from the free throw line as well. But a player that really, really stood out to me. Now, this is in, again, 43 minutes, so that's a lot of basketball for Seth, but 18 points for Seth, 7 of 8 from the free throw line, massive 12 rebounds for him. I thought it was a really positive game. He felt more incorporated into the offense. Something I've talked about is him getting to the free throw line again, and he did that against Boston College. Like I said, getting to the line 8 times, converting 7 of them. He's a sneaky, very good free throw shooter this season. From the line, Seth is 63 of 74, 85% on the season. So he's a great free throw shooter. Love to see him getting to the line. I was impressed with Seth's play against Boston College on Saturday. Justin, what did you see from Seth, and how does he start to get more and more involved in the offense after he returned from that short stint when he was out with injury?
Yeah, I think it's two different aspects when you go out hurt. For one, you got to get back into game shape. You got to kind of find that rhythm individually within the game, but you also have to find, okay, with the way the team is playing now, how do I fit into that? Right? I mean, we talked about this, but Seth was basically the number two option before he got hurt, and then you go out hurt, and Ian comes in and has the stretch that he has, and is still playing really well. And so now, how do you fit back into that? And I think this last game against Boston College kind of for me is the best picture of kind of how he fits best into this, right? Like 18 and 12, that's not a bad night at all. But like you said, 12 rebounds, but 5 of them were offensive rebounds. So, he's in there getting the team second chances, right? It's tough whenever you are going one shot and out every single possession. That was what made our team so great was almost 50% of the time if we missed a shot, we were getting another opportunity because we had bigs or even guards and wings getting to the offensive glass. So for me, when I look at Seth, it's like just be great at all of the little things, right? Hit the offensive glass, use your athleticism, defensively, be a pest, be the number one guy on defense when it comes to guarding the opposite team's best player. And then when it's your time to go be aggressive like he did, right? Continue to attack downhill. I mean, he shot 8 free throws, but the whole team shot 33 free throws, which is unbelievable when you're able to get to the line and basically have the opportunity to get that many free points. So I loved what I saw from Seth. Obviously, from game to game, it might be different, but being consistent and doing the little things, there's nothing wrong with doing that, right? It doesn't make you less of a basketball player, have less of a role on this team because you still have the opportunities to be aggressive when the time comes. But if you're kind of that catalyst when it comes to getting an offensive glass, defensively being physical and getting into passing lanes, and being able to get out in transition, then you make this team really go when it comes to kind of doing those dirty things. So I loved what I saw from Seth. I mean, I think he'll just continue to kind of merge and get into a flow with kind of everybody that's playing well and playing a lot of minutes right now, and it'll just get better and better.
He was back in the starting lineup as well. The starting lineup was Cadeau, RJ, Ian, Seth, and VAL. That was the first time that group had started this season. So yet another new starting lineup for North Carolina. Van Allen did not end up playing a ton of minutes. He was in foul trouble. He only finished with 14 minutes. The lion's share of the big man minutes went to Jalen Washington. 26 minutes for him. He had 18 points, 7 of 10 from the field, 4 for 4 from the free throw line. Only 6 rebounds, didn't have any block shots. I think that speaks to some of the issues he had on the defensive end there. Felt like he was getting overpowered a little bit, and UNC needed Van Allen's size and strength inside, but he was in foul trouble a little bit. So that's just sort of how it goes game to game. One thing that did impress me with Jalen Washington on Saturday, his passing, I think stood out for me again. There are a couple plays that UNC ran, a couple sets in the second half that allowed Jalen Washington to catch the ball in a short roll and kick it out to Ian Jackson again. It's a simple pass, but that's a big time pass for him to make to find that open shooter. So I liked seeing that out of Jalen, even if he didn't have his strongest offensive game of the season. We do have a little bit of information on Jalen because I know everyone saw what happened to him in the game on Saturday regarding his injury. So I spoke to UNC beat reporter Evan Rogers, friend of the program, Evan Rogers. He said after the game, Jalen Washington explained that he was, quote, completely fine. But tonight on Hubert's radio show, he said that Jalen did not practice on Sunday. So that could just be precautionary, could just be the big fella getting a day off, but something to keep an eye on for sure, especially as UNC heads into this next stretch of critical games. So, Justin, what did you think about the big man rotation on Saturday? There'll be some people who say What did you think from Ty Claude's minutes? Could he see an expanded role, especially if Jalen Washington is out? What do you think about that big man rotation moving forward?
Yeah, I've been back and forth, kind of all season, and I think I've settled on first and foremost. Obviously, pray that Jay Wash's knee is good, whether he comes back and plays the next game or however long it might take, as long as it's not a season-ending type injury or something of that serious nature. Obviously, we hope and pray that he's good, but it's good news that he's you know up and moving around and he's good to go from that standpoint. I think I've settled on Jay Wash being kind of that number one guy, and it's for a couple different reasons. Yes, defensively, there are times where he kind of gets overpowered. There are times where maybe he's kind of out of position, but I think his length and just him being almost 7 feet tall gives the best rim protection that we have. Right, you've got Van Allen Lubin, who's a little bit stronger, can play a little bit tougher, but at the end of the day, he's basically my height. He's 6'8", right? So when you play against guys that are maybe 6'10", 6'11", there's only so much you can really do with that kind of height discrepancy. So, and then you kind of look on the other end of the floor, right? Last few games, Jay Wash has been really, really good playing out of the pocket and playing off of dump offs and going up and finishing at the rim or with his touch that he has. So I think Jay Wash going forward is going to be really key for this team. Now, that's not minimizing or taking away the minutes that Van Allen is going to end up having to play and, the effect that he's going to also have to have on the game. But with Jay Wash, I think you just get kind of the best scenario when it comes to the bigs. Now, Ty Claude, he's come in and he's brought some energy, brought some physicality, brought, the kind of work ethic that you need from a guy who has to step in these kind of times. But I think to be consistent and for this team to, go on a run, Jay Wash is probably the most important big. And he showed, obviously finished with 18 points last game. Had some impressive little touch shots, floaters around the rim, finishes at the rim. So, like I said, hopefully he's good to go in however long, and that he can kind of be that guy at the center spot, and everybody else just brings energy and brings that physicality that maybe isn't, Jay Wash's strength on the defensive end.
Ty Claude has a few fans here in the chat. I don't want to cut your face off, Justin, but I'll bring these up real quick. Dr. J, Ty Claude, 10 minutes a game moving forward. This one from Bart Watts. Claude had me off the couch yelling, "Hell yeah." I think we can curse. I mean, that's right on the line, I think, of what is allowed. I
I
might
love
get
it.
an email from Ben after that for that, Bart. So
Hey
thanks
Ben,
for
blame it on me, man. Blame it on me.
setting me up there. That's a good call out as well. If you're watching us here live on YouTube, feel free to throw a question in the chat pod for Justin. We'll get to those questions a little bit more later on in the show. Another interesting performance on Saturday was from Elliot Cadeau. Um, Against Wake Forest, that loss, 13 assists to 3 turnovers, just a really masterful performance there to dish out 13 assists. That was a season high. But he follows that up against Boston College with 4 assists and 4 turnovers. And, on the message boards, there's been a lot of talk about Cadeau, debates about whether or not he's just his impact on the team. I think, it's a kind of a polarizing player so far this season with Elliott. One thing I will say about him is, one thing I've noticed, it seems like sometimes he can be a little bit disconnected from the offense when he doesn't have the ball in his hands. I see him a lot. When he's on the floor, he always needs to take the ball out under the basket, and oftentimes he'll pitch it ahead to another guard, kind of get a transition break going. But that outside of that, I mean, he's not always a part of the offense if he doesn't have the ball in his hands. One stat to back that up, I was looking up the percentage of your baskets that are assisted. And a lot of UNC players, let's say, for example, Ian Jackson hovers right around 50%. RJ Davis is at 45%. Elliott's percentage of baskets that are assisted is 21.5%. So that's just about the lowest on the team, if you're excluding some of the kind of lesser players who are on the end of the bench there. So Elliott, on the one hand, he's a really masterful creator, but on the other hand, it feels like sometimes if he's not getting those assists, he's not incorporated into the rest of the offense. We've talked about the shooting as well. Justin, I know, game to game, it's a different performance sometimes, Wake versus BC with Elliott, but what are some of your thoughts about Elliott's play, and especially too how he's evolving as a player? He's in his sophomore season. He's a player who has NBA aspirations as well. How do you think he's taking steps forward to continue to grow his game, and what do you expect from him the rest of the season?
Um, I think with Elliott, I think it's tough to look at those numbers and really take really something from it because of the type of player that Elliott is, right? RJ is a catch and shoot, uh, play off of a closeout. Yeah, he's done really well off of pick and roll this year as far as playmaking and things like that. But RJ's really, if you pay attention, he's best off the catch, right? So that's the type of player he is. Ian is a wing, so all wings really you're playing off of the catch a lot of times. So that's what you're most comfortable with. Elliott, he's done nothing but have the ball in his hands his entire basketball career. So to now expect him to be able to be somebody that plays off the catch or is a catch and shoot type of guy, it's just not realistic. So with Elliott, I think it's just more of being consistent. I would say more mentally, right? Not saying that he's been up and down mentally, but when it comes to okay, if you have a game where you have 13 assists, right? So you're super involved. You're playmaking for everybody, getting into the paint, kicking it out, dropping it off to bigs. You're really involved in the game, right? So then you go into a Boston College game where you have 4 assists, which means maybe they're guarding you differently. Maybe they're not going over ball screens or they're not really, respecting your shot from the outside, right? So how do you affect the game in other ways? Mentally, you have to be able, it's just like a shooter that's not able to find one, in a game, right? You might be missing, you might be 0 for 9. I was 0 for 9 my junior year in the national championship game. But it was like, how do I find ways to affect the game and affect winning? And so for Elliott, okay, you know what? Offensively, maybe I'm not super involved. So what I'm gonna do is defensively, I'm gonna make sure that the other point guard on the other side has the worst night possible. And I'm gonna make sure to get up, pressure, be physical, maybe get a couple steals, get out in transition, see the ball go in that way, feel like I'm a part of the game that way. And then that energy just flows through everybody else. And so I think watching Elliott, that's kind of what I would that's the one thing I would say is just be consistent in affecting the game in winning ways, right? Maybe that's one night you are able to show off your unbelievable passing ability and you have 15 assists. Maybe one night you've got it going, you hit 3 or 4 threes, right? But then every single night should be picking up the other point guard, or picking up the other ball handler and making their night the worst night they've had in ACC play. And I think that's what I want to see. He's got the athleticism, he's got the speed, the quickness, he's got all of that. He's got the IQ, obviously, with the way that he's able to play make for these guys offensively. So now it's just a matter of doing that each and every game, no matter what his effect on offense looks like. And if he can do that, I think everything will be totally fine. So, I mean, with somebody like Elliott, with somebody that makes plays the way that he does, right? I saw somebody basically say that you know, Elliott is always going to make mistakes. When you always have the ball in your hands and you're always trying to make plays for somebody else, right? There's going to be mistakes. There's going to be games where he might have 3 or 4, maybe 5 turnovers. It's just the way that it happens. But if he's able to make up for it on the other end, then you can't really say too much. So I think that's my only encouragement to him. Just make the other point guard's night awful, and everything else will be totally fine. We already know you can pass the ball and make plays. Now defensively, just give me 30 minutes of just being that. Somebody that I'm on another podcast with in Ray. If you go back and watch Raymond Felton's minutes when he was at North Carolina, he picked the ball up at no less than the opposite free throw line every single play, right? And now that takes extra conditioning. It takes a different mentality, but Elliott has all of the tools that Ray had, whether it was speed, athleticism, all of those things. So when I see that, it's like, okay, I think Elliott can do that. And if Elliott does that, I mean, it slows the other team's offense up. Now you're not going against an offense that can just free flow, right? Now you're not necessarily talking about the difference in size because now they're being sped up. So I think that's what I would tell Elliott, and I think he has the capability, and he's shown it, throughout his 2 years at North Carolina. So I think that'd be huge for him and the team.
One of the reasons why I bring that up as well is you've drawn comparisons in your clip last Thursday and in other appearances. This team to the 2021-2022 Tar Heel team. And I think one big thing with that team is they had one truly elite lineup that they found at the tail end of the season and kind of rode that through the tournament. That lineup being Armando, Leaky, RJ, Caleb, and Brady Manick. If you look at some of the advanced metrics, that lineup was right at the top of the charts nationally. It feels like with this UNC's team, with some of the things we've talked about, still finding what's that exact right mix in the post. What's the right mix with these four guards? It feels like we still haven't quite found that perfect five-man lineup yet. So then, Justin, to kind of close out the Elliott conversation, if you're picking that best five, that closing five, do you think that Elliott is a part of that closing five every single time? Does the best version of this UNC team include Elliott on the floor, even if that means sitting Seth or sitting Drake? Like, there's some tough decisions in there. And are you putting Elliott in that starting five no matter what?
I think it depends on the game, and it's not because Elliott's not one of the best players on this team. I
Mhm.
think it depends on, hey, if we're at the end of a game and which unfortunately we really haven't been in a ton of these games, but we're at the end of the game and we're up and we're having to kind of, run some clock and execute offensively and get a good shot. Elliott has to be on the floor, right? He's the best playmaker. He's the best point guard when it comes to getting everybody set up and getting guys shots. If it comes down to, hey, we really need some scoring towards the end of the game, right? And a lot of these teams, I think you've seen it throughout the season, but a lot of these teams are starting to kind of sag off of Elliott at times, or if he has the ball, they go under ball screens. And so, at times you might need a different scoring punch. You might need a Seth and an RJ and an Ian and Drake and, Jay Wash type lineup. So I think it's just from game to game with this team, I think it's going to be a little bit different. Just like with the big rotation, Luke said it best whenever he was on the show a couple weeks ago. Um, it has to be by committee, right? Like the big situation has to be by committee. Do I think Jay Wash is probably the most important five man for this team? Yes. But everything else has to be by committee. If Jay Wash doesn't have it going or if they have a really physical big, then Ty Claude or Vin Allen have to come in with the physicality that they have and match that. If Jay Wash has the size advantage or they're really getting some good things, out of the pocket or having him, play on the low block or in the short corner, then Jay Wash is the guy. So it's the same way for the rest of the team. I think there's certain guys that you will see in at all times at the end of the game. And I think that's RJ and Ian and probably Drake at this point because of just everything he brings to the game. But I think Seth and Elliott, once again, it's nothing to them not being good enough to finish out a game. Like those guys are some of the best players on this North Carolina team. But for this team to win, it's going to look different each and every game, I believe. And so if guys can buy into that, that's one of the greatest parts of basketball is it being a team sport and guys buying into whatever it takes to win. I just saw Alabama, who's number 4 in the country, right? Alabama Nate Oates, their head coach, just sat Mark Sears, which we saw Alabama just sat Mark Sears the entire second half of their last game against LSU. And the reason he said was because he said that he wanted the guys out there that was going to help this team win, right? Now, whether there was a little bit more that happened, because Mark Sears is like a 2,500 point career scorer in college basketball. So maybe there was a little more to it. But if Mark Sears can be benched, right, and they figure out a way to win a game, or he's leaning on that, then this North Carolina team has to realize, hey, we're just trying to win games, right? Like that's all we're trying to do. We're trying to keep our tournament hopes alive. We're trying to win as many games as we can going down this stretch, and whatever that takes. If that means I got to sit out the last 5 minutes of a game, then so be it. Um, but you know, for this team, that's just kind of what it's going to have to be.
Yeah, some really great perspective there on the different matchups. I want to take a second to thank and acknowledge our two main sponsors for this show. First, Johnny T-shirt, the best place for Tar Heel gear. They're a Chapel Hill tradition since 1983, and they are 20-year partners of Inside Carolina. Visit them on Franklin Street or check out their big online store. Additionally, want to shout out Congruity, the leading provider for Tar Heel business owners' payroll, HR, and employee benefits needs. Inside Carolina listeners can get a free payroll and HR assessment by emailing Matt at Congruity. You're listening to the Shooting It Straight podcast here live on a Monday night on the Inside Carolina YouTube channel. We'll be right back with more UNC basketball talk. I'm here, producer John, with Justin Jackson. We're talking UNC basketball here on a Monday night. Appreciate everyone who's tuned in live to watch us. It's an exciting night on the Inside Carolina YouTube channel as well. As soon as we're done, Tommy and the Football Roundtable podcast will be going live right after us. So if you're watching live, stay on the Inside Carolina channel and be sure to watch that next show after us as well. So shout out to them. For going out and talking some football once we're done here. Before we look ahead to the next 4-game stretch, I want to look back one more time, and this time not to something that happened on the court, but to something that happened off the court. Justin, your appearance on Theo's podcast last week made some waves. We got a question actually about this from Clint, kind of along the same lines, a little bit of what you were talking about last week with Theo. Clint says, Justin, has the boosters woken up? Landon Caleb Wilson showed me they paid up. Have the boosters found the price to win? I thought that was a little bit of a funny comment there, kind of in line with what you were talking about last week on the podcast. So I encourage everyone to go check out that clip on the Theo's podcast to the Baja, their YouTube channel. But we wanted to keep that conversation going a little bit. Justin, as someone who's been a part of this North Carolina basketball program, part of all the history, you have the jersey behind you tonight. And when things aren't going right with the program, as things have been at times this season, or maybe in other seasons past when UNC's had a little bit of a down year, do you, the former players, are you guys thinking more from a, not necessarily a blame perspective, but from an ownership perspective? Are you looking at the players on the roster, or are you looking at the coaching staff to kind of fix things? And another way you can take this question too is your experience playing on teams that have had losing seasons. What's it like in that locker room? Is it the players kind of talking with each other and searching for answers, or is it more on the coaching staff to kind of be able to send that message and get things back on track? So a couple different ways you can take that question there.
Let's see how we want to answer this. I think the two differences between players and fans is fans immediately go for the coach when things start going wrong. I'll say the majority. I won't say all fans. The players, from experience and from playing for a coach, from playing for a coach that's a Hall of Famer and has won a lot of games, right? There's a certain aspect of player accountability that has to be had. And I think for us, I truly believe that HD and that coaching staff is doing the same thing that Coach Williams did. But Coach Williams held all of us to a certain standard and held us all accountable each and every day in practice, right? Whether that was, we had a thing called second loss of ball. And if you turn the ball over twice, you had to do a half court and back, right? They would call you out on it. Or if the wings didn't get to the offensive glass, you'd have to do a half court and back, right? So just little things like that would make you realize, okay, I got to do this. So then that gives you, okay, this is the standard that we're playing at as a program. And if guys aren't doing that, then I can call my teammates out. Obviously, there's a healthy way to do it. On the podcast with Theo, Theo had told a story about when we were in the Final Four against Oregon, and we had certain matchups, and there were certain things you weren't supposed to do. As far as the guy that I was guarding, you were supposed to be up every time because he could shoot at any time. And we switched, and he wasn't up. He was a little too far back, and the guy knocked down the shot. And I yelled at Theo, Theo, get up. Right. So there's certain things within the game that the coach shouldn't have to say. Um, and I think that is where I always lean towards is there a leader out there holding guys accountable? Um, and I think at times you just don't really know with this team. You just don't really know who the leader is, right? There was a game where James Brown, the freshman, came into the locker room and was trying to get everybody going, right? There's been games where you've seen RJ kind of speak up in huddles, right? But then you've seen other times where there really hasn't been a voice truly out there. And so for me, when I see it, it's like, okay, who's the leader? And it doesn't have to be one guy, right? Like all the teams I was on, yeah, you had guys like Marcus and Bryce and Joel James and Kennedy and guys like that. But it was a team wide type situation when it came to the accountability and the leadership. Um, and there was no hard feelings. When I yelled at Theo after the game, we didn't even think about it, right? Like we walked off. We were still brothers. We were teammates. Like it that's just how competing works. So I think, you can say it's a mix of things, but I always lean towards the players. Just from being a player, I never liked whenever coaches would like take the blame when we were the ones out there, unless it was obvious that like there were some coaching decisions that maybe shouldn't have been made. But I never liked whenever a coach would just take the blame, and it was really the players not going out there and doing what they were supposed to do.
One more thing to add on to this conversation, another layer. One thing that struck me listening to you, Kenny, and Luke last week on the pod. You said a few weeks ago. It was only last week. Time flies
Hey,
on us
I
here.
got I got two kids. Sometimes the days you know, kind of run together.
That's right. But it was really impressive to me. Just that relationship that the three of you had. That's something that takes a lot of time to form those relationships. Trust takes time. Teammates learning to trust each other, becoming, a real team over the course of not just one season, over the course of a few years. And the accountability is all looped in with that. So the question there is, how does all of this player accountability change in this new era of college basketball with player movement and the transfer portal? Because you could have someone who's a transfer who comes in and they said, "Hey, this isn't the way that we did it at my last stop." They might not have as much time to get ingrained into the Carolina basketball family and the culture around that. So how do you think that changes it as well? Just, these players don't have as much time to build those deep relationships, so that when you're in a national championship game and you yell at your teammate there, Theo, that's just not a teammate yelling at each other. That's really, a 3-4 year relationship that you are able to trust in those tough moments. I'm curious how that changes for you in this new era of basketball.
Yeah, it definitely changes. It's definitely a little bit different when it comes to the whole NIL transfer portal. But the more I think on the transfer portal NIL, right? And this is from obviously I've never been a coach. I've never been in any kind of role when it comes to coaching. So this is all from the outside looking in. But when I think about like a program, right? My program would have a certain standard, right? So North Carolina is North Carolina basketball. It's a little bit different um, than what Coach Williams was, just from the plays they run, the personnel, just some of the things that they do, right? But when it comes to the standard, if you're not living up to the standard and how we play as North Carolina basketball, then somebody else can figure it out, right? Um, and I think that's the same way as players. The more I really think about it, right? You might have somebody come in like Cade Tyson, right? That comes from a different school, or somebody like Vin Allen who comes from a different school. And maybe they've been programmed and they've played a certain way for so long. But at the end of the day, you're at North Carolina, right? So if I'm RJ, if I'm Elliott, if I'm Jay Wash, Jay Witt, all these guys that have already been there, right? There's a sense of, hey, this is how we're going to play, right? And this is how we play. But it's also a certain mentality of, and this is how we're going to play because we want to win, right? All the extra stuff is we'll figure that out. But to have the perspective and the mindset of we're trying to win it at really any cost, right? And that means by doing it the North Carolina way because we're in a North Carolina jersey. So I think there's a certain level of um, responsibility for guys that have already been there, right? To be able to step up, to lead by example, but also at times when you got to kind of rally the troops, right? Like, hey guys, like let's get back to what we do. Um, and so that's kind of that, that's kind of my feelings on that. I think it is obviously way more difficult when you have guys coming in from different schools and they've played for a certain coach or a certain program for so long. But it's no different than when a freshman comes in to school, right? Like, and that's at a lower level, right? Like they don't even know what college speed and physicality and playing hard really means. So I think um, I think it's just a matter of somebody stepping up and saying, "Hey guys, like, do we really want to win? Right? Do we want to make the tournament? Do we want to make a long run? Do we want to try to win a national championship?" And all of that, you can begin to define what that looks like as everybody gets on one accord. Right? I think at times during the season, you've kind of seen it's been kind of just sporadic, right? Like there's been games where there's no real flow to the game, right? Like RJ might get a few shots here, and then Ian might go and get a few shots here, and defensively, one guy might guard the ball really well, and then all of a sudden they swing it, and then boom, that guy doesn't guard the ball, and it's a layup, right? Everything doesn't really move at the same rhythm. And so I think that's kind of what it is. I think the accountability part, I'm looking at Matthew's question here. What is the definition of accountability? I think the definition of accountability for me is if you're not living up to your end of the deal, I think it should be called out, right? Whether that means by a coach, by a player. If you're not in the right help side spot on defense, your teammate has the ability to call you out and say, "Hey, you're supposed to be there," or the coach has that ability to say, "Hey, you need to be there." Now, how a coach handles if the guy continues to not be there, that's on the coach, right? Like I'm not going to sit here and say, "Oh, Coach Davis should do this, should do that." I'll never be that. But I think there's that certain level of accountability of, "Hey, if you're not doing what we need you to do to win, then we're going to call you out on it because we want you to be as good as you possibly can, and we want our team to be as good as we possibly can. And for us to do that, you have to be in the right position." So that's kind of my thought on accountability. Um, I know it was a little long winded, but I've seen a lot of things going on and a lot of things being said. I think at times from people that don't look at the bigger picture. Um, and I think that's kind of how I look at it whenever I look at this North Carolina team.
One last thought on last week's podcast. There was a comment from Mr. Felton about, UNC fans and maybe they don't play basketball or things like that. So I've got my shoes right there just to prove, I have played it, not competitively or anything, but just to get that back. So you can report back to Raymond on that, Justin. Maybe at least one
I'll
person
let
is
him know.
playing.
Don't worry.
Yeah,
I'll let him
playing a
know.
little bit. We want to turn our attention to this defining stretch for UNC. The next 4 games will be very challenging starting Tuesday at Pitt. The Tar Heels' next 4 games are against teams whose records are combined 47-12 overall and 22-5 in ACC play. So that's a pretty strong level of competition there. Justin, when you look at this next 4 set of games, and I'll run through them just so our listeners know what we're talking about here. Like I said, at Pitt, at Duke, home against Pitt, and at Clemson. What are some of your major keys for North Carolina to come out of that stretch with a successful record?
Yeah, I mean, I think these 4 games can change the way that this North Carolina team is looked at, and I think it can change the trajectory of their season within just these 4 games. You go into a game against Pitt, I think it's called the Zoo, is at Pitt. And what's this is kind of a side story, but their best player, I think his name's Jalen Lowe, is actually the son of he was my AAU coach growing up. So I don't like when people say I'm dating myself, but it's kind of crazy to see him out there like really playing well. And he was just a little kid running around the gym whenever I was playing for his dad. But you've got a team like Pitt, who I think is very beatable. Obviously, they've got the guard play and Low and I think Leggett, I guess his name is his name. Very similar, shoot like 20 free throws a game. Um, they've got size as far as height, but it's a little bit more finesse when it comes to the bigs that they have, other than I think one of the big fellas is a little more physical. But you have that game. Then you go into a rivalry game. Obviously, Duke has, as much as we don't want to admit it, they're a really, really good team this year. But when you have a rivalry game like this, everything goes out the window, right? It doesn't matter. And so you've got that game. You win that game. That's a massive, massive win. And then you play Pitt again, trying to run it back. And then you play a Clemson team that's, has some good wins and is a really good team. So I think it's one of those where, hey, these 4 games, yes, the next game is the most important. This next Pitt game tomorrow is going to be huge for them to go in here and hopefully quiet that crowd, get after them from the jump, and play really well. But you go one by one throughout this 4-game stretch, and you come out 4-0. I think this season looks totally different. All these conversations that we're having of, the negative side of things, I think things start to look a little bit more positive. So, I think it's they're very capable of completely turning around this entire season, and this season isn't even, in the trash yet. So, I think I do want to go back to and hit on before we close this out. People, a lot of things that I've seen is people talking about this, the offense that is ran um, within this new team, and I think I saw something the other day of, they're running a pro style offense with not many pros, right? Well, my basically my whole career at North Carolina, all 3 years, we would always start out with secondary break, right? Every single team knew what secondary break was. Every single team. It was a swing, some sort of guard back screen on a big, then the bigs screen for each other, and then you try to get the ball inside. If not, you swing it. And every time, if that didn't work, we went into freelance. We had no secondary option, like no secondary plays outside of that. It was freelance. Now, freelance is literally what it sounds like. My junior year, it ended up being basically like the bigs were just setting screens for all the guards to come off down screens, or guard to guard screening and cutting, and that's literally all freelance was. Right. Sometimes it would turn into maybe every once in a while a ball screen for Joel, or the guards out front, but the play calling, I don't think is an issue. These guys run more plays than we ever ran when I was at school. Um, I think it's just for this team, it's figuring out what the strengths are, right? Figuring out who is good where. Like, for instance, that play that you talk about earlier in the show where Jay Wash gets the ball in the pocket. And I think it was Ian Jackson twice with 2
Mm-hmm.
corner threes.
Yep.
You run a play like that, and you have Jay Wash there who has a great touch in the paint, but also has shown that he's able to pass the ball. And then you've got, outside of RJ, probably the best 3-point shooter on the team right there in the corner, right? Like, having situations where you get an advantage, but then everybody is in the right spot, in the right, to be able to play to their strength. I think that's the biggest key for this team. I think a lot of times you watch them start to kind of, you know, dribble, dribble, drive, dribble, and that's just because guys maybe aren't in the right spot or there's just not a ton going in that possession, and that's okay. That happens in basketball. But I think for this team, it's having more of those kind of plays, having guys in the right position, having guys who have shown that they're knockdown shooters in spots that they're going to be open, having guys who are slashers able to get to the rim like a Seth and a Drake and an Elliott be in spots that can play off of swing closeouts, right? Like there's so many different things that go into the offense. And if these guys can figure out and find that rhythm of where guys want to be, where they need to be, then I think this team has a chance to, throughout this 4-game stretch, go 4-0 and continue winning for the rest of this ACC conference play.
I'll add one more thing on top of that. Would love to see them continue to make that extra pass, go from good shot to great shot. I think that's another missing piece that I'd love to see more of from this team throughout these next games. We will be back next week to talk about the big game against Duke. That's Saturday, February 1st. But first, the game on Tuesday night. It's a late one. I believe it's 9 o'clock against Pitt. Yes, it is. So be sure to tune into that one on Tuesday night. One more thing as well for everyone watching here. Remember, there is a show right after this. Tommy and the Football Roundtable will be going live at 9 p.m. So go get a cup of coffee or whatever, and then be sure to tune into that football show. Tommy always does an amazing job with the roundtable. Justin, I'll give you the final word tonight. Any final thoughts, any final previews for the week ahead for UNC basketball?
Huge 4 games. Continue to hit on that, but massive 4 games. Obviously, seemed like a tough game against Boston College, but sometimes you gotta just pull them out. Sometimes you just got to get lucky every once in a while and get a win and move on to the next one. And so it's super excited to see how they are able to respond in this first game against Pitt and continue that. I just keep on saying, as fans, you can have your critiques, you can have your ideas, but don't let the negative and the criticism overpower the support that these guys need on a daily basis. As much as it might not seem, players see a whole lot more than what you think they do. And so continue to support. Obviously, like I said, call them out when they need to be called out. But I'm excited to watch, and I know these guys are gonna play really well going into Pitt and going forward.